Welcome to Ask Sean, where I explore all sorts of questions about life, relationships, and being human. I'm Sean Slevin, a licensed professional counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist. And if you have a question for me, you can submit that anonymously at www.asksean.org. So today I want to talk about trauma, which is, of course, very much talked about in our culture these days. And in particular, I want to explore my definition of trauma. Now, this is building on very much, kind of all of the um, things that I've learned about trauma in the counseling field, and you know, common definitions and whatnot. I mean, things in the DSM, and so I'm not gonna repeat those definitions. You've got Google, you can go look those kinds of things up. This is my synthesis and kind of how I'm trying to condense down, these complex things into something that at least I find useful, hopefully will be useful to you in terms of really orienting us towards, number one, acknowledging where our growing edges are, and thus then what do we want to work on? What do we want to work on healing and growing and stretching, building muscles around? Um, I think that this articulation may be unique to me, but it's hard to say for certain. I read and study pretty broadly and deeply, and I honestly can't remember uh, if if this is only like a slight rewording of kind of someone else's concept, and if that is the case, my apologies to whomever for not remembering. And it certainly is, like I said earlier, it's building on the brilliant work of so many other people in time past and here in recent history, kind of in the counseling field. So as the expression goes, very much standing on the shoulder of giants. So I can't claim to be doing anything super original here, even if maybe I'm kind of languaging this a little bit differently, perhaps. Um, so my definition of trauma goes something along these lines. That trauma is any experience that I cannot bear to stay present to. That trauma is any experience I cannot bear to stay present to. Or to put it differently, we might say any experience I cannot bear to stay present to is probably traumatic for me. Um, so let's unpack this because there's a lot going on. I'm condensing a whole lot of psychological ideas into a few words there. So let's start with just this idea of being present. Like, what do I mean by that? Because actually, a lot hinges on that, and it's also what I love most about this definition. So I'm partly borrowing from, building on. There's this concept in the counseling field called the window of tolerance. And I confess I can't remember if it was Dan Siegel that coined that first, or Peter Levine. Um, it was definitely very much a significant part of my sensorimotor psychotherapy training. Um, so yeah, I can't remember who originated, kind of who first kind of came up with that concept, and yeah, and just this whole idea of the upper and lower limits of a window, and when we're outside either the top range or the lower range, um, that's when we're getting into unhelpful dysregulation, we might say. And that's a little bit tricky. I mean, dysregulation's, if I would ever say dysregulation is helpful, but particularly what I mean is that it's becoming traumatizing. Like the further we get outside of our window, the more that we're not able to integrate what's happening. And so that's why I really prefer to think of this as window of presence. And so that, as far as I know, is my particular articulation, because I think that's really what we mean. And there's a common thing in the counseling field that, like, we come up with these technical terms that are technically accurate and descriptive, but aren't always, I feel like, great for just sort of day-to-day use. Um, so, I mean, window of tolerance is a fine term and works well enough. But ultimately, like, I don't want to just be able to tolerate an experience. I want to be able to be present to it. Like, I think I guess that's part of what I like about this idea of presence is it has embedded in the definition what the goal is. The goal is to be able to be present to all of my life. And so if something is happening, like whether it seems to another person or not to be traumatic, but if something is happening that for me, I can't stay present to, then that's a piece of my life I'm not living. And it's an experience that's not getting integrated. And so that means it's going to continue to affect me until I do the hard work of integrating it. So there's like two problems there. One, right? Like one is like I'm not living my life in that moment. I'm not actually being able to show up and live my life and experience my life. But also, this experience is going to continue to shape me because it's something has happened that's been outside of my window of tolerance, my window of presence, like what I could stay present to, what I could have the emotional, physiological, um, psychological bandwidth to be with. Um, and so, yeah, so it's gonna the energy of that's gonna stay stored in my system, like the impact of that, but it's not woven together in a coherent way, and so then I'm gonna have weird reactions to things in the future that I may or may not even be aware of what that's coming from. But I'll just, my system will be like, I feel nervous about that, or anxious, or angry, or whatever. Um, and so then that's going to continue to shape my life, which is going to continue to prevent me from living my life in certain areas. Um, so yeah, so this idea of presence is that I be able to be grounded, have a sense of I'm okay, I'm safe, even in the midst of intense experiences. So being present doesn't mean pleasant, right? Like I could be present to something really hard. Um, I could be present to really intense grief or something very, very scary. But if I'm still present, kind of in this way that I'm using the word, then I'm feeling the entirety of it. So somehow I've got enough of a toehold of groundedness that I can feel the entirety of the experience, and thus it's integrated. And that then is not going to stay in my system as trauma. It's very difficult, and we might still, in the way that we language things, might still like say, "Oh, that was really traumatizing." But technically, that isn't true. It actually wasn't traumatizing because I stayed present for the whole thing. I felt all of it in a present way. I was able to bear it. And so then I come out the other side, and that actually isn't going to haunt me. Not that I'm not going to remember it. Not that there might not be things I reflect on and whatnot. But there's not going to be like sort of chunks of energetic experience that I couldn't stay present to, and so had to kind of get shunted off, kind of in my psyche and in my body, because I couldn't be with it in the moment. Um, So yeah, so this idea of presence, I don't know, I find it really compelling. I think in part because philosophically, I think this is the goal in life is to be able to be present, to be able to be present to the beauty and to the horror. Now that can sound a little confusing, right? Like, why would you want to be present to the horror? There's a couple of reasons. I mean, one, again, all these things I've already said is like, well, if something horrible is happening in my vicinity, like I want to be able to have the capacity to ride the intense waves of emotion and come out the other side and be able to have integrated that experience. Um, like so that it's not shaping me and haunting me for the rest of my life potentially. So that's one reason, but the other is that I believe that we have a responsibility as we grow and heal to do what we can to repair and heal the world. Um, Not in some kind of like, none of us are saviors, we're all just humans, Um, but how can I help redeem? How can I help heal what I can't stay present to? If something horrible happens in my community and I can't bear to stay present to that, I want to say that's very understandable. I want to circle back to kind of say a bit more about that, but I'm not going to be much help, right? Like because at that point I'm one of the wounded. I'm one of the casualties. Um, I'm one of the people who I couldn't ride the intense waves of emotion. It got too far outside of my window. I hit my edges and went beyond, and so my nervous system starts to have to go into all sorts of ways of surviving, and I'm not being fully present for that experience. And so then, as people around me are suffering and results of whatever the awful thing was, I can't really be beside them because I can't even be beside myself. Like, I've got parts of me that I can't be present to, parts of my experience. So yeah, so I think that's an additional thing here, right? Like embedded in all this, and I think this is really important for our culture. Embedded in this definition is this idea that I'm very convinced of, although I acknowledge that it's maybe somewhat controversial. Um, but this principle um, that the goal in life is not to be comfortable, but to be alive, to be awake, to be present. Um, I like my comforts. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm in air conditioning right now. It's running, and so it's me here in the background on the recording because I don't have a recording booth or whatever. And I am really grateful for air conditioning. I'm somebody that I've got all sorts of challenges with sleeping well, and don't do great in like a humid context. Like I really like air conditioning is really really helpful for me. Um, so I'm not against comfort per se, but there is a way in which our culture, in I think a sincere desire to bring a lot of compassion to a hurting world, I think partly in response to the ways in which modernity has sort of framed human beings as machines, and that has a lot of really cruel implications in terms of how we have treated ourselves and treated each other. And so there rightly is this sort of like, kind of groundswell of like human beings need compassion, and we do. But I think there's a lot of compassion, and this I think is across the board. This is not in any. I'm not picking on any particular like political or whatever cultural group or class here. But I think a lot of compassion ends up not having wedded with it a vision for like our responsibility to grow and heal, to help ourselves grow and heal, to help one another grow and heal. And so then that has a way of robbing us of our agency. Like a compassion without responsibility, I think can inadvertently end up being kind of cruel because we can just kind of get spiral down into like a powerless kind of place, where we're not connecting with like I actually can grow and heal. Like I can take my window that's this wide and I can expand it. I can do the hard work to expand it and expand it and expand it such that I can be present to more and more of my life. And so that things that once were traumatizing for me no longer are traumatizing. Um, and that's just, I think, just a better move for all of us. This doesn't mean, I mean, I'm imagining maybe a potential objection culturally. Like, this doesn't mean that we don't work for systemic changes and whatnot, because there's all kinds of brokenness in the world. And I can't begin to try to, in the context of this, get into, kind of all of those details. So yes, we still work for systemic change, but that has to be rooted first in our doing our own work. If we're not being faithful with ourselves, like who do we think we are to like be trying to change some larger system? How can I trust my judgment if I haven't been faithful to like be dealing with my own trauma, my own struggles? Like I kind of think it's a little bit I don't know. I mean this is kind of a thing like with my counseling with my clients. Like I don't ever ask clients to do something I haven't been willing to do myself. This doesn't mean that I have lived every single detail, right? That the people I work with, have experienced, but the underlying emotional things. If I'm trying to help someone, make a shift, like I'm trying to help them based on I know it's possible because I've done it and I'm still working at it. Because this process doesn't work as far as I can tell. Like counseling doesn't really work if the counselor isn't living out these things too. And so I think that principle applies, kind of on a broader cultural level as well. Like that if we're trying to implement sort of broader systemic changes in society, if we're not living the changes, like really living them in our gut, which means doing hard, scary work, then yeah, our efforts are gonna end up going sideways without our realizing it. Um, so, anyways, that was a bit of a tangent. Although, if you've been following my videos, you know that that's nothing new for me. Um, so yeah, so coming back to this definition of trauma, that trauma is any experience that I cannot bear to stay present to. I'm kind of talking here again about that being present to something means I'm grounded enough that I can ride the waves of emotion no matter how intense they are, and I'm still able to remain myself. Doesn't mean that sometimes it's like I feel like I'm just barely, holding on by my fingers to the cliff edge in terms of, having some grounding. Um, but I've got enough that I'm present. I know what I'm feeling. I'm not, I'm not going into any of the survival modes of fight, flight, freeze, collapse, etc. Um, so yeah, let's see, what else do I want to say about this? Maybe I'll talk a little bit about maybe just kind of some potential weaknesses or downsides to using this definition. So one potential objection, I guess, maybe is what I mean. One that I've thought of is, well, is this watering down what trauma is? So like the DSM would talk about, life-threatening events and things like that. I don't have necessarily any problem with those kinds of definitions. But I guess it, that misses that like if what makes something traumatic is that we're not able to integrate it, and so thus it gets stuck in our system, and then haunts us to some degree, which, if you have enough of that, that's what makes you potentially start to meet the diagnosis of PTSD, right? You're having flashbacks and that kind of thing. So that's a certain level of severity and, in certain diagnostic categories. So yeah, I mean, there's a sense in which trauma is very relative, which, is not in any way, I don't mean that to, I guess here's the tricky thing is that like we use the word trauma in different ways. So, we might say a car accident is traumatic, and in one sense that as a descriptor that is true. Like what a horrific thing, right? And yet whether it's traumatic for a given individual depends on what their experience was. Now, actually, we can kind of think about this. We can kind of reason our way around this with even thinking about it physiologically, which is another one of the potential objections with this definition. Is like, well, does this hold if we're thinking about physical trauma? So, like a physical trauma, as in, like, okay, say I'm in a car accident and I break my arm or something. So this is where we have to kind of like expand our definition a little bit, or at least what's embedded in it. So if the definition is, anything that we can't stay present to is traumatic, and really what we mean by being present is that we're still ourself and we're grounded enough. We are sort of the integrity of our psychological system is intact. So if we're thinking about that, if that's what's embedded in presence, that we are still solid in the midst of really hard things, well, then that does actually work, I think, even for like a physical trauma. because we would say, okay, so say something, hits my arm, I'm in a car accident and I smash my arm on the dash. If my arm has no damage, we would say there was no trauma. I mean, that's how we would think about that medically. If I break my arm, we'd say, okay, that was a trauma. If it's bruised, we would say that's a degree of trauma, right? Because the integrity of my physiology didn't hold up, which, is very normal, very human. And so this actually gets at a really important thing, right? Like, there's nothing to be ashamed of in experiencing trauma, which doesn't mean we don't experience shame, right? Because we all have baggage, and we're all prone to shame, and that's one of the harder things we have to work on as humans, is being able to set limits on our shame and not be overwhelmed by our shame. So, if I'm in a car accident and I break my arm, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, laws of physics and whatnot, like my body's only so strong. And so, at some point it's going to give. And there's going to be trauma there. And it's going to take time for my body to be repaired and be reintegrated and become whole again. So the same thing is true psychologically, right? There's always going to be, no matter how much we grow, there's always going to be an upper limit. There's in terms of like the upper and lower limits of like how big our window is. And we keep expanding it. The goal is to keep expanding it as much as you can in your lifetime, right? But there's always going to be the potential that something's going to happen. You're going to have that perfect storm of a day where it's like, yeah, it throws you outside your window. And you're not able to be fully present. Maybe you're partly present, maybe you're not present at all, but there's going to be bits of experience there that you couldn't stay with, couldn't fully feel in the moment, and so aren't totally integrated. And just like with our body, the good news is we can do healing after the fact. But yeah, I think this is really important that we not shame ourselves. I think that's a tricky thing here. I was talking with a friend recently about this definition, and one of the things they raised is like, oh, well, so, does this mean I need to try to be present to this and to this and da-da-da? And it's like, well, it's not like a got to thing, right? Like, this is casting a vision. This is an invitation for how we, I think, are meant to grow and what I think we're capable of. But it's not meant to be a shame thing or just like, oh, gosh, I got to be present to all these horrible things in the world. It's like, well, no, let me just start by being present to myself and my own life, because I guarantee you there are parts of your life that you are not being present to. I mean, this happens in a very small way. And this is, again, exploring sort of maybe, the stretching this definition a bit, or the potential of that, but, a very small way, right? When you're checking out on your phone, when I'm checking out, zoned out on Instagram, like there's a difference between my being present on Instagram and when I'm engaging with Instagram versus when I'm checked out. And the checked out kind of in this definition means in a tiny way, like something is a little traumatizing. Now that's a little bit stretching, right? Because it's like, what the heck is going on that's traumatizing there? And this is where, again, I think the potential objection of like, is this watering down how we think about trauma? And that is a concern of mine, because I don't want it in any way. Yeah, I don't want to water things down. But I feel like in some ways the word trauma is getting overused anyway in our culture. And also I think it's being used a lot because people are genuinely overwhelmed. Now, the thing is that here's the tricky thing, like, because we're being overwhelmed doesn't necessarily mean that anybody's doing anything wrong. It just means I'm outside of my window, right? Like, so if I'm zoning out on Instagram, I am bumping up against my limits to stay awake to my life in that moment. Because the healthier thing, right, if I'm zoning out versus actually intentionally and like in a mindful way engaging with Instagram, which has a very different feel in my psyche and in my body. But if I'm zoning out, like I'm trying to escape from something. There's something I'm trying to not feel. Is it my tiredness? Is it that there's something I need to do that I don't want to do? Is it loneliness? Is it a difficult conversation I need to have? Like what is it that I can't bear to be with? And whatever it is I can't bear to be with, it isn't going away. It's going to still be waiting for me. It's still in there, not fully integrated, because I haven't been able to handle feeling the feelings, riding the wave of the emotions, and coming out the other side and being more integrated. So I don't know, I'll be honest, I don't know if we need some more language here. Like, I really like this definition. I think it's very useful. But yeah, I'm also open to like having some more terms here. Or maybe, maybe this definition, maybe I don't call this a definition of trauma. Maybe I call it a definition of something else. Um, but what I really love about it, again, is that it is casting a vision for like where I think we're invited to go. Like we're invited to increase our capacity to be more present to our life and to eventually all of life. And so coming back to my friend's kind of concern, of like, oh, this feels heavy. This feels like burdensome. Like, I think our responsibility first and foremost is, am I being present to my own life? Because if I'm not being present to my life, I can't actually be present to somebody else's. And so this is, I think it's actually revealing, right? This is kind of a thing in our culture, right? It's like, oh, well, now I need to be present to this and present to that, and present to what's happening on the other side of the world, and da da da. And look, all those things matter, all those lives matter. But am I being faithful and responsible with my own life, right? Like, am I dealing with my own home, my own household? And I don't mean that in some kind of like, I don't know, selfish or self-centered way. I mean it in the sense of like, as we often talk about, you know, the example from when you're getting, you're in on an airplane and the stewardess or the steward, talks about like, okay, if the oxygen masks come down, put your own mask on first. Because if you don't put your own mask on and you're trying to put everybody else's mask on, then you're just going to collapse and, and you're going to, potentially hurt someone else, or maybe even keep them from getting their mask on. So it doesn't help things. But a lot of times we can have this drive and this pressure of like, oh, we got to somehow take care of everybody, because that's a way that we're further avoiding actually being present to ourselves and to our own life and to the parts of us that we can't bear to be with. And so it feels a little easier to like, I'll sort of kind of like, deal with this indirectly by, interacting with this person or helping that person. But I'm not actually being with me. I'm not actually being with my parts. And so I actually can't genuinely be with other people and with their parts, or at least not with the parts of them that are similar to the parts of me that I can't be with. So yeah, I don't think this doesn't need to be a burdensome thing. It's certainly isn't meant to be a shameful thing. But it's meant to draw our attention to, where am I being present and not being present? Like, if I'm like making some food and I accidentally drop, my peanut butter and jelly, open faced, not yet put together. I drop it on the floor face down. Like, I need to be able to feel disappointed about that, right? I need to not like, I mean, this is such a, like a relatively small thing, right? But am I letting that matter? Doesn't mean I need to like, make a big to do about it. I just need to feel whatever it is I genuinely feel, like what, whether that's big or small. I need to let it matter. I need to feel any emotion about it, which might be like 5 seconds of just like, that is not what I wanted to have happen. Or maybe I'm at the like end of my rope for the day and it's just like, are you bleeping kidding me? What the hell? Like, and I need to be able to be honest about like my rageful disappointment, so that I can eventually drop into my sadness of just like, I am so tired and I really wanted to eat that sandwich. And that was my, whatever, my last bit of, peanut butter. And like, this sucks and I'm sad. So it's like, yeah, we need to be able to be honest about what we're feeling, feel it in the moment so that we can move on. Like, not move past, but move forward. Like, I actually felt I was present for the experience and I'm moving forward and figuring out, okay, well, I guess I can have the thing off the floor. Do I want to do that? I haven't cleaned the floor in a while, so it's probably not a good idea. Yeah. So I don't know. I think this whole idea of presence is just really, um, I don't know. That's just really, I find it really helpful and really compelling. Because I guess to me, it's like we, I guess one of the questions I've been asking is like, okay, so how does a community grow their capacity to navigate trauma? And it's like, well, I think that fundamentally is we are expanding our capacity to be present to our own lives, to the good and the bad of our daily lives. That we're practicing being with those little things, and expanding our capacity to be with harder and harder things. Because we've all got stuff that we haven't finished working through. We all have stuff that we are afraid of dealing with. Um, I mean, if you if you're wondering what some of yours is, start paying attention to what you orient your life around. Like, what are the things that you work really hard to avoid? What are the things that you're just like, oh yeah, no, I don't do blah blah blah, and get curious about, like, what is that about? Um, what is it that makes it so unpleasant that there's such a strong reaction there? That what is it? Why am I putting all sorts of energy into uh, you know not being with, not feeling, not having to engage with certain things? Um, hmm. I'm trying to think if I have anything else that I want to add. That might be all for now. So I think I want to do a subsequent video. I'm not going to go into it in this. I'm sure it's been plenty long, as my videos usually are. But I think I want to do a subsequent video. Maybe I'll record it after this. If I have the bandwidth. But thinking about all of these concepts through a Christian lens, because there's some interesting things I think there too. Um, kind of bringing some Christian thought to that, regardless of whether a person is a Christian or not. But I think there's some interesting ideas to kind of playing with this definition. Um, so yeah, well, I hope this has been helpful. Hope maybe it give you a way of kind of making sense of some of your struggles. Um, not as I hope it's apparent. Like, I don't mean this as a way of making excuses for ourselves. Like, so this isn't like oh, well, I couldn't stay present to that, therefore it's traumatizing, therefore nobody can ask anything of me there. It's like, well, no, that's not the answer, right? Like, the goal is to get stronger, to get healthier. So, don't please don't misuse this. But yeah, to be able to, I hope this can help. This can help you make sense of your life in some ways, in some places maybe that you haven't been able to. Um, and whether you want to use the word trauma or not, I mean, I'll leave that up to you. I think it still technically works. I think it still fits, as far as I can tell. Um, but I hope that the biggest takeaway that I really hope you pay attention to is this invitation to expand our capacity to be present. Um, oh, and I guess, yeah, here's maybe something I did want to say more about. Um, yeah, this is this is really crucial. This is why people have outlines, but I just kind of try to hold it all in my head. So this is what we get. Um, yeah, I mean, so it's like to build this muscle to expand our window. A way of thinking about how we do that is we need to have adequate internal and external support for whatever the difficulty is at the edges of our window, whether it's the upper edges or the lower edges. And so that means, like, here's a way of thinking about this. So if you're trying to learn something, it needs to be, it needs to actually be something you don't know, right? So it needs to be something new. Otherwise, no learning is taking place because you already know it. So it needs to be a little bit beyond you, but it needs to not be so far beyond you that you can't, start to work with it, right? So, like, what's a good example? I mean, it's, like if you're, in academic programs, that's why they have prerequisites. It's like you need to have calculus and statistics and this, that, and the other before you can have, you know, this physics class or that physics class, because there's certain things you need to be able to have already stretched yourself on before you're ready to stretch yourself on these other things. If you try to skip and you don't have the capacity, don't have somehow the learning already, then it's going to be too much. And so then it's there's no learning happens because it's like I don't even know where to begin. There's all these symbols on the board, and what the heck does that mean? I have no frame of reference. Same thing applies if you think about exercise. So if you're like, okay, I want to train for a marathon, and it's like, okay, well, let's start by running a quarter of a mile, and then half a mile, then a mile, and then like let's work our way up. But if you haven't run at all and you're like, I'm just going to go out and run 10 miles, well, you're pretty likely going to get injured if you can even finish the 10 miles. Now, maybe you happen to be in really good shape for other reasons or something, or you're kind of maybe naturally good at it or something. But in which case, not much new like sort of stretching is happening or muscle building, right? But for most of us in that kind of situation, right, it's like we got to work our way up to longer and longer distances, more and more challenge. And so we try to have the level of challenge be such that it's like it's just doable enough but still hard, right? So we can do this intentionally, right? If we're trying to expand our muscles, like we can intentionally kind of move towards some difficulties, either in our life or internally in our history, and do that in a way where we are either sort of setting ourselves up well with adequate support internally of like, okay, I'm making sure I have lots of rest. I'm in in the like a cozy room, and so now I'm going to turn towards this difficult thing. Like I've sort of set up my environment and kind of put myself I'm coming with as much resources as I can. But even there, right, we're going to hit limits. And so this is where having outside help is helpful. So that, that can be a counselor, that can be a trusted friend, that could be a family member, that could be clergy. It just, what matters is that the other person has capacity to be with whatever it is we're trying to be with, that they're not going to be like, I got to pull away or I got to shut this down or something. So this is again why counselors have to have be doing their own inner work. They have to be having their own counseling or something like counseling as clients, so that we can help other folks, so we can walk alongside folks. So that's and that this could easily be its own longer conversation, because in some ways it gets so particular to the person and the situation. Like, what are the ways in which you need more support? And so again, that's different than don't ask me to do anything hard. It turns the conversation into, it's good for me to do hard things, but I do need some help. Can you walk alongside me as I try to do this? Can you stand with me as I attempt this thing? I mean, in physical therapy, right? Like that's part of what happens, right? The physical therapist is like, trying to gauge how much is this person capable of stretching themselves into, but not too much. And, and so they might literally like be holding the client's hand, the patient's hand, as the patient is like, rebuilding some, muscle strength in their legs or something, or rebuilding balance. But the goal is that the patient be able to eventually have as much capacity as they are capable of, kind of in the long term. Because that just feels better, right? Like we want to, not in like a silly American, I got to do it all by myself, but I want to be connected with a sense of agency. Like I want to mobilize as many of my capacities as possible. And then, there's going to be places where it's just like, certain things may always just be hard. And so it's like, we're working hard at like for little itty bitty gains, and that's okay. Like this isn't a race. There's no medals, right? Like we're just responsible to do what we can with the life we've got. Like, so don't measure yourself against someone else's life. Like, measure yourself against your own. Like, and kind of your growing sense and growing clarity of like, yeah, I really would like to help this heal more, and I'm hoping there's more potential here, and I'm going to keep working at it. Like, we don't ever have to give up on any parts of us. That doesn't mean that everything's going to be perfectly healed in this life, because I don't think things are going to be perfectly healed, but things can be more healed, and we can expand that window, and we can be present to so much more. Um, I had an experience of this recently where I was, yeah, it was kind of scary. I was run off the road by a huge dump truck. He was definitely way bigger than me. um, and I blew my tire in the process. And there was no shoulder. Um, and so it's like a lot happened there very intensely, very quickly. And then there went on. I mean, I might share more of this story in another example at some point, but like just this like several things went wrong. Like I tried to repair the tire, that didn't go well. I ended up blowing tire sealant all on my face, which I was really grateful that I wear glasses because they protected my eyes. Um, and then I didn't have cell service to be able to call for a tow truck. I mean, it was like thing after thing after thing went wrong. Um, but this is a kind of experience that would have really rattled me. Like any number of those parts, it would have brought up shame, um, like what's wrong with me? This happened, or maybe I shouldn't have taken this road, or all these kinds of things. Um, but I just kind of rolled with it. I mean, it was disappointing. It was a little frustrating, right? Like, wasn't cool, the dude being in my lane and getting run off the road, and or dude or dudette. I don't know if it was a man or a woman. All I saw was giant truck that I was not going to win a game of chicken against. Um, but I was really struck by like, wow, my window of presence has expanded so much over the years. And so this experience that was disappointing, was inconvenient, was costly, um, was kind of comical in terms of how many things went wrong subsequently. Um, but it just was like, okay, well, I mean, I had my feelings about it, but I wasn't overwhelmed by them, and I didn't need to disassociate from anything. I just was present to all of it and just felt what I needed to feel and moved on to the next thing, and then felt what I needed to feel about that and moved on to the next thing. And eventually it all got sorted out, and I got on my way to vacation. Actually, I was like trying to go on to vacation. It's literally on my way out of town when this happened. Um, so yeah, we can grow so much. Like we are capable of so much. And so yeah, don't abandon hope on any part of you. Some parts, are going to be, you know, harder to heal than others, but they're all worth it, and you're worth it. You are worth being present for your life. You're worth living your life. Um, and we need each other, right? Like the world needs us to do our work, so that we can be more present to our lives, so that we can be more present to each other's lives, because I think that's actually what's going to change the world, is our capacity to be present to one another in all sorts of things, in all the beauty and all the hard. um, so I don't say that as any kind of burden, but just as an invitation of what a wonderful thing that we can grow in these ways. Well, that's all for now. Until next time, peace be with you.